Hey everybody, and welcome back to the History Reader. Today is going to be the first video for our non-fiction November read-along, in which we are reading James Holland's The War in the West. This is Volume 1, Germany Ascendant 1939 to 1941. We're doing this alongside David Murphy, so he'll be doing similar videos on his channel. For those who didn't see the announcement video, we are doing one part per week, so that basically works out. There's 4 parts, so it works out quite nicely, and it's very readable in like one part a week. It's not heavy in terms of the prose. It's actually quite an easy read, so definitely even if you're a little bit behind and you want to join in, very much keep up. So what is the context here? Basically, James Holland is part of a newer generation of historians of the Second World War. There are a few historians who have written in the past and written quite extensively on war. Obviously, the Second World War is one of the most written about historical topics, but you sort of have these mainstays of Second World War historians, people like, more recently at least, people like Max Hastings and Anthony Beevor are the ones that you'll find on like bookstore shelves all the time. And the way these things work is that generally they're going to have some sort of single volume history of the war. So, for example, I'm just quickly looking here. So Anthony Beevor has a book called The Second World War, and that is quite thick. And this one is more of a battlefield history, I would say, of the war, rather than a political history or a sort of more personal history of the war. You've also got Max Hastings, so he does. I actually don't have any of his books on the war here up on the shelf. And then there are people, like plenty of people have written about the war. Ian Kershaw, who wrote the biography of Hitler, which came out in the 90s and early 2000s, has written fairly extensively on the war and obviously focusing on Nazi Germany. So this is sliding into that. But because we're in the 21st century now, we're not so focused on a lot of the things that we were focused on in the 70s, 80s and 90s. And also we've got a lot of detail now because a lot of the diplomatic and political and sort of grand strategy aspects of the war have been played out now. We can start to focus on other things, and Holland does this really well. In fact, the diplomatic and grand strategic and political stuff in here is actually quite weak. That is one of my problems so far as we're going, but he does the economic side of things quite well, and also the part that he excels in, and I imagine, I don't know for sure, but I imagine this is what he must be a specialist in, is the weaponry that is being used and the specifics of the weaponry, and how it affects the battlefield operations. So in this first chapter, in this first part, it's broken up into quite short chapters, and what he's doing here is he's setting up the war. It's always a little bit of a difficult decision to make for historians when they are writing a history of the war, because you can't separate it from, like, there's no clear start date necessarily in which you need to start writing the history. Obviously the war itself starts, at least the common definition for the war starts in 1939 with the invasion of Poland. But for example, we have Richard Overy, who's just released a new book on what he calls the Great Imperial War, and he sets the start date with the invasion of Manchuria by the Japanese in 1931. So where do you start it? There is absolutely an argument to be made for starting your history with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. But then how far back do you go? Do you need to explain the First World War as well to write your history of the Second World War? So there's always going to be stuff left out at the beginning of a history like this, and stuff that the reader is going to have to fill in for themselves. Holland decides to start it. Basically, he does an interesting little timeline thing where in the first chapter we get the invasion of Poland, and then we go back a few months, and he starts it with this basically narrative or this painting of the summer of 1939. You see a parade over in America, in New York, for a New York Yankees player. You see sort of people going on their holidays, their summer holidays, enjoying the summer, but having this sort of tension bubbling, that war seems to be coming, seems to be bubbling up. We are starting here obviously after Munich, which was kind of at least in previous histories of the war, has been shown as one of the moments where the course of history may have been changed. Obviously we can't know that for sure, but we're sort of working here within these couple of months before the war with effectively an inevitability. The war is coming, and how are people dealing with this? Then we basically get some stories, and I'm interested to see how he sort of carries on following these people's stories. He's got a list of principal characters in here at the beginning of the book, and there are a bunch of them. I'm seeing here there's an Australian sapper, there's obviously the big players, but there's also small individual people, individual soldiers, and we get to follow some of them already through this beginning section. I think that's a really smart way of approaching particularly the war in the West, because you're not able to really easily separate the war that's going on in other places, the war in the Pacific, the war in Africa, although I don't know if he's going to get onto Africa at any point in here, but the war in Africa, the war in the Pacific, the war in the East against Soviet Russia, the various fronts that sort of open up, war in the Mediterranean, you can't separate them. They have a bearing on what's going on in the West, and so I think it's quite a smart idea for him to zoom in and look at the battlefield experience of various people and explain what's happening in a broader sense through their experience, and I think that's what he's going to start to do here. It's also where he shines. His writing really, really shines. He spends one chapter in here talking about the U-boats and what the experience was on the U-boats at the outbreak of war. And there is in particular a story which I haven't heard before, and I thought it was really fascinating. I'm going to see if I can pull it up. Basically, it was we get a story in here about U-41, which goes and attacks convoy and then gets sort of pinned down by destroyers, and he has this really haunting description of this engagement that happens where the U-boat has to go down to the bottom of the ocean and literally lie on the seabed and have these depth charges coming down and exploding right near the U-boat, and you just get the sense of how frightening that must have been. Holland does this so well by including the various things that are going to be going on in the minds of the submariners. Things like calculating how long this depth charge is falling, because you don't know how far away it is when it's exploding. But calculating like the sound when they hear it hit the water and then hear it explode, they can kind of calculate how far down it's coming and how close it is. The sound of the destroyers above them, the decision about when they can safely come up, and obviously they're running out of oxygen, things that are getting really hot inside the U-boat, and then that sort of catharsis as they come up onto the surface and are able to open the hatches and breathe in fresh air for the first time in like a dozen hours or something. He does that really, really well, and that is what I'm most excited for as we go through the book, is reading stories like that on the various battlefields. And I think that is really going to be what sets this book apart from other books. The other books, the battlefield histories have been written, the political histories have been written. This is obviously a new book. It has to cover that stuff, but it has to do it in an engaging way and in a way that people today are going to care about. And in the wake of things like Band of Brothers, we need to be getting those personal stories. So in terms of the actual narrative of the war, we leave the war here basically at the brink, at this point where we know that where Germany is about to attack France. So we live out this phony war, although he doesn't use the term, which I quite like, because it's not necessarily a phony war, it's just this lull in the war after the invasion of Poland. And he plays out a few scenarios. He argues in here a little bit that perhaps the French should have invaded Italy during that period, 1939, 1940. I haven't read enough about that, to be honest, to make a judgment, but that's a really interesting idea, and possibly could have changed, it would have changed the course of the war, but perhaps not in France's favour. I don't know, but that was really interesting. But I think this part one, it really is an introduction. You get sort of little snippets of stuff, but because we're not onto the battlefield, I don't think this is going to be the strongest part. There's stuff in here that I disagree with, particularly around the rise of Hitler. I think he probably shouldn't have bothered touching on that too much. He doesn't need to in here. And I think that some of the things he says are a little bit, not wrong, but lack context. And so it's not the end of the world, it's a couple of paragraphs, but I think this beginning is not the strongest part of the book. It's going to be as we go through and the battles start to be fought. So anyway, that's what I've got to say about part one. Hope you're reading along. I'll link David's video when he posts it. He'll definitely have a little bit more eloquent he'll be able to express his thoughts a little bit more eloquently than me, and he's very, very well read on the Second World War, so he'll definitely have some very, very interesting stuff to say about it. So hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next week for part 2.